Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll just give it another minute before we begin. Okay, so hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, where the Trove team and the Freshfields team will be collaborating to demystify the use of carbon credits for climate targets. My name is Ashni and I'm part of the commercial team at Trove Research. I will be hosting today's webinar. Before we begin, I would like to go over some house rules. All attendees are automatically muted. So if you have a question throughout, please insert it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I will then facilitate the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Today's speakers are Guy Turner, CEO and founder of Trove Research, and Lucian Georgeson, lead analyst for policy from the Trove team. Joining us from the Freshfields team is Jake Reynolds, Head of Client Sustainability and Environment, Vanessa Jakovic, Partner, and Charlotte Aspin, Associate at Freshfields. For those of you who don't know, Trove Research is a data and intelligence service specializing in the voluntary carbon market, built on 30 years experience across financial services, carbon markets, combining deep sector knowledge and proprietary data, as well as cutting edge models. Freshfields Brockhouse Derringer is a global law firm with teams spanning specialisms, regions, and industries to deliver against three fundamental client needs: transactional, regulatory, and risk. A trailblazer on ESG issues, Freshfields advises clients on the strategic risks and opportunities fundamental to achieving short and long-term sustainability. This webinar will cover why use carbon credits for corporate climate action, current trends in corporate climate targets, when and how to use carbon credits, types of carbon credits, how to access the market, net zero commitments and carbon offsets through legal, regulatory and policy lens, and finally key issues and mitigating risks in sourcing carbon credits. I will now hand over to Guy Turner, CEO and founder of Trove Research.
Thanks, Ashni, and good to see so many people tuning in for this webinar. It is an incredibly timely subject, so we're delighted to put this on with Freshfields. The services that Trove, Ashni introduced earlier, we are a data and analytics company. We work in 5 main areas. We track a lot of the policy developments that are affecting this market. We track all of the about 6,000 carbon projects and forecast that. We look at the carbon credit prices, both over the counter transactions and on exchange. And we monitor the corporate climate commitments and actions of over 5,000 companies. And then we run our own crystal ball forecasting model that tries to project how this new market may evolve over the next 10, 20 or 30 years. So we're delighted to impart a fragment of that wisdom to you today on this new subject. So why use carbon credits? It's been on the news a lot in the last year or so for good and other reasons. But why are companies now taking such an interest in this on these carbon credits and the offsetting world? Well, I think there's three reasons. The first is that the rise in the number of companies making long-term climate commitments is evident of the interest that corporates have in taking a position on climate. The evidence of climate change is even more obvious now. It used to be in what scientists used to model would happen within 50 years or 100 years. Now the evidence is right in front of us. And there is pressure on companies to show that they are taking a position and doing something about it, not just setting a long-term net zero or decarbonization target, but taking action today. And the engineering requirements to take carbon out of direct emissions and indirect emissions will take many years. And so the carbon credit world can be accessed a lot more immediately. And there are a number of big companies already doing that. This was data from September. This is one of the things we produce every month, which is a tracker of all the company purchases of carbon credits. Companies from Shell to Delta Airlines, Nespresso, Tokyo Gas, Apple, Volkswagen, dipping into the market, acquiring carbon credits and using them against their corporate emissions. Logitech, for example, just going to highlight a couple of companies. Logitech has been very clear that it's using it as a bridge to a longer term decarbonization goal. And I think that is symptomatic of how companies see the use of carbon credits. It's not the end game. The use of credits will, by most models, sort of comprise about 10% of the reductions that are going to be needed to stave off the worst effects of climate change by 2050. But carbon credits can be accessed much more readily in the near term. Microsoft plans to remove more carbon than it had emitted over its entire history by 2030. So they're taking a leadership position as well. You want to go to the next one? And so that's at the corporate level. And a number of companies are using carbon credits to enhance their products. These are all customer-facing organizations. We're just highlighting a few. There's no real selection here. But many companies are wrapping or including the communications on their climate and their carbon credit purchasing into the products themselves. So Allbirds is a shoe manufacturer, a sustainable shoe manufacturer. Konica Minolta, a printer and tech company. Leon, a fast food company, and Brewdog, a beer manufacturer in the UK, and are promoting their products with that carbon neutrality, often label associated with it, that is very visible to customers. In the energy sector, the big companies, for example, BP and Shell, have been retailing carbon neutral type products, so lubricants for Shell, and both lubricants and retail pump fuels for BP, and have sort of built sort of additional services on that basis that customers can see and helps differentiate their products. So there's a number of different uses. The final reason why companies are interested in this is there's a lot of pressure, not just from customers, but from stakeholders. And in particular, this is a map that we maintain and update, which is the number of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that are trying to influence corporate action on climate. There's a group that are pressuring investors. So publicly listed companies will have to respond to questionnaires from a whole range of fund managers and pension funds down the left-hand side of this chart. And this goes on. This is like 2 slides of a much longer list. So there's pressure from investors asking detailed questions about what companies are doing on climate. So companies are in a position to respond. They have a number of ways they can communicate that. Carbon neutral is a commonly used term, and also net zero. But they're by no means the only words that companies use. In fact, we count about 30 different terms that companies have used or are using in their communications. That range isn't particularly helpful because customers and stakeholders need to try and navigate that. But we functionally, the carbon neutral world is different from the net zero world, in that companies can claim a carbon neutral status today if they acquire a number of carbon credits of high quality that can be sort of offset against their product or their corporate emissions. A net zero term is used to define a future target and a journey which will take many years to achieve. So it's nearly impossible to claim net zero today. And there's a number of, my colleague Lucian will explain a little bit more about that going forwards. But those are the two main sort of terms that are used. There are, the net zero is really trying to get a company to a point of zero emissions through a combination of internal mitigation through their direct and indirect emissions at some point in the future. And there are discussions about whether that should include entire supply chain emissions, so scope 3, or just the direct and indirect. A lot of the NGOs and pressure groups are saying it has to include scope 3, which is the indirect emissions throughout one's supply chain. And those numbers are large. We calculate that across all the companies that are setting long-term emission targets, there is enough coverage of those emissions to, in effect, cover the whole world's greenhouse gas emissions because of the importance of scope 3, which includes all of the downstream emissions from all the energy products in the energy sector. And today we track all of this on a regular basis. And as at the end of October, there are some 7,000 companies that have set long-term climate targets. About 1,500 of those, so the top row here, are SBTI, so Science-Based Targets Initiative with a net zero target. There's another 600 or so which have got a net zero target that isn't aligned with that science-based target, which is a 1.5 degree warming pathway. So this would include, for example, the oil and gas majors who can't reduce the emissions to the level that would be needed to get a science-based targets validation. And then there's a range of other type targets that could just be self-declared under row 4, or an SBTI interim target that doesn't quite meet the 1.5 degree pathway. So there are a lot of companies. These are some very, very large companies as well. This is small, medium and large companies here, but a significant and growing number of companies. And this final slide that I will talk to shows the increase in the number of companies setting a target that has been approved by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And we are now up to about the purple lines at the bottom are the ones who've set a target. The gray lines are the ones who are committing to set a target at some point in the future. So we're up to nearly 2,000 companies now who've set a target. And I think one of the really interesting features of this on the right-hand side is that dark purple line, which is the number of companies setting a 1.5 degree target, which is really ambitious, has been increasing even since the start of the year, when we had the Ukraine-Russia war start. And I think this is symptomatic of two things. One, companies' continued interest in having a response to the pressures on climate change, and two, not being too dissuaded by short-term economic challenges, because these targets last 10, 20, 30 years. And you've seen that trend line going up on average, even since the start of the year. So, this is being taken seriously. And I think, the question really is, well, how can we bring forward action to comply with those longer term commitments? I'll hand over to my colleague Lucian, who'll just quickly sort of run through some bit more technicalities on these new terms.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks, Ashley, and thanks to our colleagues at Freshfields. It's great to see so many on the call today. So, with so many companies committing to set a net zero target, or having already had one validated, we wanted to run through a little bit about what are they committing to in terms of using carbon credits. And as Guy noted in the definition of net zero, the requirement is for neutralizing emissions that are considered unavoidable at the net zero target year. And this is usually defined as being 10% or less of those baseline emissions for most sectors. And this must be done with removal credits. The reason for this is the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere must take place in order to cancel out those avoidable emissions and not merely to either compensate for or offset those avoidable emissions. There is some emerging guidance about what companies should be doing along the pathway towards net zero between now and that point, sort of probably around halfway between now and their net zero target year, when we think that companies should really start to ramp up their interest in and purchasing of removal credits in order to help build that pipeline for the credits that will be necessary for net zero by 2050, but also to increase their own engagement and understanding of the purchasing of removal credits over time. But there's some emerging guidance about what companies should do in the interim to balance out that need for climate action today and climate action beyond the supply chains and operations of their own company. So as we see here with the Science Based Targets initiatives, the SBTI and Race to Zero, they're encouraging the use of carbon credits, both either reduction or removal, on the path towards net zero to either contribute towards climate action beyond the company's operations and supply chain, in the case of the SBTI's recommendations, or in the case of Race to Zero, in order to maintain carbon neutrality on that path towards net zero. But the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative, which was launched last year, is developing guidance to provide verification for claims, or a code of practice that can be verified for claims that companies are making about the use of credits that goes beyond those necessary emissions reductions for their emissions reductions targets. So this represents an option for companies to demonstrate how they're engaging in a high quality, high integrity use of carbon credits. And so while we're expecting more guidance from the SBTI on their position towards beyond value chain mitigation in 2023, as the VCMI claims code could be a valuable path forward for companies and is an emerging viewpoint about how to balance this need for climate action today with the long-term emissions reductions necessary, we wanted to talk about it for a couple of minutes, as it's worth keeping an eye on, as it's guidance that is at this stage a little bit more concrete than some of the other organizations out there. So the proposed claims code of practice has 3 possible tiers of claim, which is gold, silver, and bronze. This structure could provide a really useful on-ramp to help companies build from where they are today, especially through the proposed bronze level, and especially for companies that have large supply chain emissions or are in high emission sectors. So starting with the silver or gold claims, the starting point, the starting line criteria for companies is that they need to have set a series of 5-year interim targets for all emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, including therefore including their supply chain and their end use, and be on track to achieve that target in the given year that they're looking to make a claim about their use of credits. So then for silver, being in this position, the companies then should purchase high quality carbon credits, reductions or removals, to cover at least 20% of their remaining emissions, but it can be more than 20%. And this share has to increase over time if they make subsequent silver level claims in the future. And then for gold claims, this has to cover 100% of their residual emissions. The requirements for the bronze, which were proposed, were a little bit different. So companies need to be on track for their reduction targets on scope 1 and 2 emissions, but then 50% of their scope 3, their broader impact. And then carbon credits could be used to cover or compensate for 50% of that reduction target in that year. And then, in addition to that, as with silver, companies should then purchase high quality credits, reductions or removals, to cover at least 20% of their remaining emissions, with a proportion increasing over time. The important thing to know about the bronze level claim that was proposed, and also in terms of it being an on-ramp, a way to help companies engage today with high quality climate action, is that the bronze level claim that was proposed would only be valid until 2030. So then companies would have to be, basically gives them a window to get on track with emissions reductions for all of their emissions, while providing a way to demonstrate their commitment today to reducing emissions. The situation we have with the VCMI is that they've published a summary of the feedback received, and so we're waiting to see how this will be reflected in the final version of the guidance in 2023, and what the final versions of bronze, silver, gold will look like. And so with that, I'll hand back to Guy to talk through, as we've discussed a lot about removals, avoidance and reductions, what kind of credits companies can use, and the routes to market, to access the market to purchase those credits.
Thanks, Lucian. Yeah, just a very quick bookend to this this part of the talk. The world of carbon credits does break down into different types of credits, and so this is just a very quick sort of classification of that world. There's a number of ways we can think about a credit, which comes from different types of projects. There are about 6,000 projects in the world that are currently generating carbon credits. The first distinction that people often make is ones based on nature versus technology. So nature-based solutions could be avoiding deforestation or restoring landscapes. Technology-based could be carbon capture and storage, renewable energy, energy efficiency, fuel switching, or reducing methane and other non-CO2 gases. The other big distinction is between removals and avoidance stroke reductions. So the different technologies, projects that remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and those that avoid the release of CO2 from the atmosphere. The Science Based Targets Initiative, as Lucian said, requires the use of removals towards the end of a decarbonisation journey. There are other flavors that sort of come into play as well when companies are looking at this. There's potentially the vintage of the credit, so how old the project is or when the emission reduction occurred. These can go back to 2012 or even beyond, although the market is increasingly looking at acquiring more recent emission reductions. Where the project is located, the location, the standard. So the two largest standard setting bodies are Verra and Gold Standard, and their methodologies differ slightly. And SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Whilst we're talking about climate change, these projects can have a number of additional benefits to support communities, ecology, biodiversity, etc. And they're often regarded as part of the package. And then a final thing, just under the color coding, there are some projects which have got much longer lived outcomes, so long-term storage or shorter term storage. And these are the sort of attributes that companies are considering when buying a carbon credit. And then finally, if you're a corporate looking to acquire a credit, how do you do it? Well, there's a number of routes. You can buy direct from a project developer. You could either go through a trader who might be holding a portfolio of credits. There are now a number of exchanges that are active. It's unlikely that a corporate would be an active member of an exchange unless they're very big and trading regularly. But there are also brokers who can introduce companies to the developers and exchanges and traders, and then finally a retailer or advisor. So a lot of companies will work with consultants who will be holding their hand through their decarbonisation journey and can provide access to the flow of carbon credits. So a number of different routes. And with that, I will hand over to our colleagues at Freshfields.
Thanks so much, Guy. This is Jake Reynolds here at Freshfields. Thanks for that incredibly helpful tour through the world of carbon credits. I've learned so much just listening to you there, and a big welcome to everyone from Freshfields. Ashley, could I have the next slide? That's great. Before my colleagues Vanessa and Charlotte pick up on the legal side, which is really where we wanted to contribute, I wanted to just reflect briefly on some of the drivers which we've been seeing for climate target setting and offsetting. And I thought I'd actually start just very briefly with our own story at Freshfields, where we've recently put science-based targets into practice. And interestingly, we've been offsetting since 2007. So that, in our case, predated the formal process of net zero planning, but it's something which we've got off the ground, I think, quite early. Scope 1 and 2 emissions initially, and then more recently, Scope 3 emissions like business travel and waste. There wasn't any formal regulatory requirement to do that. It was something which felt right to us. Our staff take pride in it. It's kind of a reflection of our values and our purpose as an organisation. But it also, I think on the slightly harder side, it also pays to understand, we feel, how the carbon credits process works, what they are, how the markets work, and also how to secure the right amount of credits at any point in time to back up any claims we want to make about carbon neutrality and ultimately in the future net zero. And from quality projects, quality sources, as Guy was just saying, and at sensible prices. So in our case, we invest in reforestation in Eastern Africa with quite significant co-benefits there for the local communities. And we've modelled all of our requirements for credits out to 2035 so far. I'm thinking about going a little bit further. So that's it's a process of familiarization really for that. And I think it sort of pays dividends to get into that space and think about how the whole system works. So looking at these drivers more generally, I've mentioned just now in our own case, the culture, the values of the organization, and the fact actually that a lot of people are attracted to organizations that have thought this through. So the talent side is significant there as well. Obviously, policy and regulation is a big driver for all of this. I think it's about 80% of the world's population is now living in a country with a net zero approach. And that's significant because as those commitments turn into policies and regulations, which may be for different industry sectors, or they may be more general, such as the UK next year is bringing into force disclosure requirements on transition plans. These things are going to affect companies quite considerably if they're not already doing so. And again, it pays to be a little bit ahead in terms of how you're thinking through what options are available. So obviously, we know many of you will be absolutely familiar with investor pressure and the role of proxy advisors. Really concerned about risks and about how the firms they're invested in are decarbonising and protecting themselves from certain risks which might materialize through the policy process or through market pressures. There's also public pressure or public sentiment towards climate change is growing all over the world. That's translating into consumer pressure as consumers decide that they want to vote with their wallets and purchase their and spend their money on companies which have got a strong story on climate change. And of course, one doesn't have to sort of think far back to more activist approaches. We've got really strong NGO activist organizations which are relentless about campaigning to try in their minds wake the world up about action on climate change. And all of these things are driving companies to think about this area more clearly and get into the whole area of net zero planning and offsetting. Thanks, Ashley. Next slide. Yeah. So I just wanted to, just before handing over to Vanessa, I just wanted to recap on this one graph. It's some stats from the roughly 1/3 of firms within the Forbes Global 2000. So the graph says 702. In fact, by December this year, it's up to already over 800. 800 out of the top 2,000 organizations, companies globally. 800 have net zero, some kind of net zero commitment. But interestingly, the use of offsetting is not specified in their plans, in their public statements about this. Up to approximately 60% of those with targets have not said anything about that. Now, one has to think, why is that? Is it, could it be explained by a lack of awareness? Or is it concerns potentially within those firms about overclaiming or making the wrong kinds of claims, the legal risks arising from statements about carbon neutrality, net zero, how they're going to access credits reliably, permanently, and even have some of the ESG issues embedded in the projects which are creating the credits in the first place. So all of those things together, I think, and the awareness which is being built, including through Trove's excellent presentation and seminars like this, I think are going to be bringing more people into that area. But we wanted to just focus briefly on a few of the legal risks which arise when they're doing so. I'll hand over to you, Vanessa, if I may.
Thanks, Jake. Jake is our internal policy expert on everything ESG, and so it's great to have his introduction, and we will now pick up some of the more legal issues. So now that Jake's explained why a climate strategy might include a net zero target, and Trove has taken us through the role that carbon credits can play in that plan and what the market looks like, Charlotte and I are going to talk through some of the strategies to manage the legal issues you might face in setting a net zero target and procuring the credits to do that. The first slide, if we go to the next one, as Guy explained, there are different types of credits, avoidance credits, reduction credits, which are a form of avoidance, and removal credits. They can be used in different ways, and we're not going to talk you through the mechanics of it, but what we will talk you through when Charlotte gets to some of the issues around net zero claims and greenwashing is how can you use the terms net zero and carbon neutral in a way that aligns with your carbon offset strategy and which doesn't indicate to the market something which is not entirely true. Unfortunately, we don't have any legal binding definitions of these terms, but what we do have is general practice and an emerging set of standards. And obviously, using the normal wording in the way that people expect you to use it is the best means to mitigate that risk. What's interesting, I did see one of the Q&A came through asking what we mean by residual emissions. Essentially, what's helpful to look at on this slide is that if you're on a path to net zero with a yearly target setting a date by which you hope to achieve net zero, then generally what that involves is a reduction in your own emissions, but there will always be emissions in virtually any business which are actually impossible to completely avoid. Even if you adopt every single piece of technology that still hasn't been invented, there will always be some form in most businesses of emissions, and that's the residual emissions which we talk about being removed through removal credits. So that's where you're actually absorbing the carbon back out of the atmosphere. If we go to the next slide, talking through some of the risks in terms of procuring the way that you would get hold of these credits, it's useful to revisit the explanation that Guy gave us around the fairly simple structure, really, that there are offset project developers and owners which develop projects, then there are emitters which purchase the credits. In the middle, we have the standards and registries, which is what I explained. And obviously across to the left, we have the intermediaries and secondary markets, because carbon credits are commodities in the way that any other form of commodity is traded. There are secondary financial products as well. But what we're talking about here is actually something really quite simple, which is that if you emit a ton of carbon or a ton of greenhouse gases, you can buy a credit from somebody who has absorbed or avoided a ton of greenhouse gas. And then you buy that credit, whether or not it's been avoided or removed now or in the future, and then you can offset it against an emission. in terms of what it actually is, it's an entry on a registry, and each of these different organisations runs their own registry, and these are essentially private companies, but they do operate according to rules, and you have a contractual relationship with them, and they ensure that we don't have double counting, for example, so that you can't have two corporates trying to offset a ton of greenhouse gas against one single one ton that has been absorbed or removed. So that's generally at its most basic level how it works. In terms of the legal issues that you might come across in terms of setting up how you would procure these, we've decided to focus on these 4 different issues, and I'm going to start with the first, which is around securing the delivery of the credits. So if we go to the next slide, there are really 3 key issues in any net zero carbon offset strategy, and they're the first 3 bullets on the left. First, if your strategy assumes the use of credits, there's a risk that they just won't be available, or in the volumes that you want, the price you want, and more importantly, the quality you want. So that goes to whether it's the right type of credit at the time that you need it, in terms of planning your path to net zero. So whether it's removal or avoidance, taking into account some of the market challenges that Lucian talked us through in terms of whether the market is growing at the rate we need it to do the offset, but also some of the broader issues around quality, like ESG, which we'll get to. Second, to address that first risk, a lot of the models that corporates use to get hold of credits involve buying them in advance, so that you can guarantee that you'll have access to them at the price and quality that you need. The risk with doing that, obviously, is that they might not be delivered. And that's because a lot of these solutions are still nature-based, and you can't just tell trees exactly the rate at which they have to grow. Trees are subject to climate. Trees can burn down. Also, a lot of these forestry projects are happening in markets where we don't necessarily have the most stable of political context, so you can face risks of expropriation or risks of crime. Technology on the technology side is new, so performance is still not 100% proven for all forms of technology, so there's always a risk that the carbon credits won't be delivered. And third is a lack of permanence. So this is the issue around how long the carbon will be stored and whether that actually matches your strategy in terms of emissions. And again, that can go to whether the land has been secured, for example, over the long term, if it's a forestry project, so that you can prevent logging in the long term, and goes to natural issues like fire. So how to mitigate these? Well, a lot of this comes down to the actual model that you use to procure the credits. So what we've got here are the 4 sort of different buckets of the way that we've helped clients to secure these credits. And as you go down the page, it's an increasing list of control over these issues that we're talking about in terms of integrity, additionality, and permanence. If you're buying credits on the open market, obviously they are what they are, and you take a choice. You do due diligence around whether the credits you're buying have the qualities that you want. You can do that either through the secondary market or through just a direct sale and purchase agreement called an ERPA, an emission reduction purchase agreement, which now have fairly standardized terms, so it's not a complicated process. What we're seeing with more sophisticated long-term credit procurement models is that you can see investment in a fund. So this is like a normal financially regulated fund, but instead of having money as your dividend, you get carbon credits. So you invest up front. You have a series of governance around the types of projects that can be invested in by the project managers that are employed by the fund. The fund then goes and does that, and then you, over time, have your return as a carbon credit dividend. And where you get the most level of control is where you have a proprietary interest in a portfolio of projects or a single project up front. You work alongside a project manager and asset developer who will help you to manage that project over the long term. And you can embed contractual mechanisms into the contracts for that type of model, so that you can make sure that you have control over the development and progress of that project over the long term. What happens if you don't achieve permanence and delivery is the same as you would manage any contractual risk for the future purchase of any type of good or service. You allocate the risk, you decide who is in the best place to do that. And obviously, the more control you have over the future development of credits, the more you can allocate that through just basic contract law and due diligence in making sure that you have the right partners in the right projects. The second risk I was going to talk through very briefly on the next slide is around ESG. You will have seen that there has been some controversy around investing in carbon credits. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that the projects that people are investing in can raise issues that, that pose ESG challenges beyond climate. One of the key issues is that in order to create a permanent long-term carbon store, often involving forestry, you have to sterilize land forever. And that can have impacts on employment security, it can have impacts on food security, energy security, biodiversity, obviously. And often these projects are being developed again in areas where there is a risk of bribery, or there might be a risk of money laundering, and making sure that you're managing human rights and delivering what we call co-benefits, which is what Guy talked us through, can be absolutely essential. If the key reason that you're procuring carbon credits is to demonstrate to your stakeholders that you have a solid ESG strategy. And obviously you don't want to be solving the climate problem, but creating a problem somewhere else through human rights or through biodiversity or through negative impacts on employment. So how do you mitigate that? Well, obviously, one of the key ways to do that is to make sure that you're selecting the right projects and that you have the right model in place from the beginning. So procuring in a way that gives you the level of control and level of transparency that allows you to buy the credits that actually align with your ESG strategy. Due diligence is an obvious way of doing that. There are some additional emerging ways of managing these types of risk. There are now some standards which sit alongside the carbon standards called, one of them is called SD Vista, another is called social carbon, where you can actually have an independent audit of your sustainable development goal ESG risks, which are not just climate related. So you can address the co-benefits around investing in employment and managing human rights. What we have seen with one of the clients that we helped with a very big portfolio investment in carbon credits recently was to embed their own corporate protocol around managing human rights and broader ESG risks into its partnership model with all of its suppliers for investment in these projects, with an ongoing reporting obligation and some very strict remedies if they weren't met by the project developer, so that they could have absolute certainty that they would have control over the projects if the ESG goals weren't met. So that's one way of doing it. Two more risks to go, so I'll hand over to Charlotte.
Thanks, Vanessa. And I'm going to cover greenwashing and regulatory links and the risks that they present to sourcing carbon credits. So of course, greenwashing, and this has been highlighted actually, by my colleagues, is arising across all of the risks, but greenwashing can arise in the context of climate targets and carbon offsets. It's where a business might give a false impression or be accused of providing misleading information about its business. An organisation that greenwashes may be challenged legally, or a representation that it makes could affect its reputation. As you'll see on the slide, we've included details of the characteristics of carbon neutral and net zero pledges. There are no legally binding definitions for these terms, but we do have numerous emerging guiding standards that are being developed within the industry. Given the difference in criteria across the terms, as highlighted by Guy and Lucian, developing strategy for carbon offsets needs to be closely considered against the target being pursued. Otherwise, there's a risk of greenwashing the impact of your credits. We've identified 3 key greenwashing issues on the left arising in carbon credits: the risk of double counting, activity leakage, and the lack of additionality. But many of the risks, such as those ESG risks identified by Vanessa, could also lead to greenwashing. Risk of double counting is where the same carbon credit is claimed by more than one organisation towards their climate target. This could arise where a person claims the benefit of a carbon credit which they sell on to another party. Activity leakage is where a carbon credit project encourages or displaces emissions to another location, which reduces the effectiveness of a project in removing emissions. For example, a project that avoids deforestation may simply displace the activity which causes the deforestation to another location, which undermines the integrity of the removal. And third, the lack of additionality focuses on projects that would have occurred due to law or regulation or part of business as usual operations. These projects are not driven by investment secured through carbon markets, so the reductions are not additional. Mitigating and preventing greenwashing is possible, but it requires some linked up thinking across your business. We've identified 5 ways to highlight, also noted on the left. First, and an obvious option, and already mentioned by my colleagues, is partnering with trusted suppliers and accreditors who will certify credits against criteria to ensure their integrity. Second, integrating these greenwashing issues across your climate target strategy and decision making will make it easier to manage. If everyone's singing from the same song sheet, it makes it a lot easier to know what's going on within a business. Which leads me to my third point. It's important to carefully communicate targets and offsetting internally with stakeholders. Understanding terms across the business will help protect against greenwashing, particularly when you have offsets which achieve different things against different targets. A fourth mitigation is recognising the difference amongst credit sources, which we've highlighted today. Nature-based, technology-based, avoidance and removal credits all achieve different things and achieve offsets at different times. If you don't understand how those work, that might undermine what you're presenting as your target. And fifth, and something that Vanessa just mentioned in respect of contracting, monitoring and reporting carbon credit sources is important in ensuring that representations from when a credit is sourced remain true for the course of a project. I'll next move on to regulatory linkages. Next slide, please. Thanks. Climate law and regulation is fast-paced and an ever-developing area, with a big push to integrate sustainability into business decision-making. As Guy mentioned, offsets are being embraced globally, and as such, the inclusion of carbon credits in regulatory frameworks is increasing. We've identified 3 key issues arising in relation to regulation and law for carbon credits that we want to highlight. The first is the link to compliance markets. And we haven't really talked about this, but obviously across the globe, there are mandatory compliance systems in operation, and those have an interdependent relationship with these voluntary carbon credit sources. Changes in compliance frameworks can impact the demand for and price of carbon credits in the voluntary market. Secondly, the continuing negotiations over Article 6 of the Paris Agreement are leading to uncertainty. Article 6.2 provides for a country to transfer carbon credits to another country if it overachieves its climate targets. The details for allowing transfer are still being negotiated at on the world stage, and most recently at COP27, but will need to be managed alongside existing carbon credit sources and are likely to have a significant impact. And thirdly, procuring credits in the context of regulatory change. As I've mentioned above, climate change is on the lawmakers' minds across the globe. Disclosure of climate-related risks and opportunities is becoming mandatory in some major economies. Typically, the focus is on targets, but carbon offset disclosures are being pulled into forthcoming standards. The International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, and the US Securities and Exchange Commission all have proposed disclosures that include specific guidance and standards for carbon credits and offsets. While the key requirements are still under development and different from one another, once in force and applying to your company, an organisation may need to disclose the role of the offset in achieving the target, the timing for the offsetting, the qualities of the offset, so the type, the accreditation, and whether the credit is an avoidance credit or removal credit. Obviously, when there's third parties like the government involved, mitigation is more difficult to manage in a regulatory phase. One way for managing the moving regulatory scene is to align internal climate strategy for offsetting with compliance and reporting functions. Those in the compliance and reporting teams will certainly be across any internal targets that might be set in accordance with disclosure obligations, and can probably best understand how offsetting fits into that. Secondly, and closely linked to internal alignment, is ensuring that you're across the global trends and international decisions. The ISSB climate standards are expected to be confirmed in early 2023 and will likely be adopted across economies around the world. For example, regulators in Nigeria have already committed to adopting the standards, and in Hong Kong, regulators are anticipating consultation to integrate those standards. To chart the impact of regulatory change, planning for offsetting can be helpful. Offsetting can be projected over a short, medium, and long term, which will assist in responding to and understanding the impact of forthcoming regulatory change on an organisation's strategy. There are certainly other risks and more mitigation options for sourcing credits, so please do get in touch if you've got any specific questions. But for now, we're on to questions, so I'll hand back to Ashni.
Great, thank you so much, Charlotte, and thank you to both the Trove team and Freshfields team for your insights. We've got about 5 to 10 minutes left for some questions, so thank you all in the audience for sending through all of your questions. We've had a ton of engagement, which is always really good to see. So I'll just have a look through the Q&A and delegate some of the questions to either the Freshfields team or the Trove team. Firstly, for the Trove team, can you explain a bit about what beyond value chain mitigation means? Perhaps, Lucian, you could answer this question.
Sure, thanks, Ashni. So beyond value chain mitigation is the term that has been proposed by the SBTi and others to refer to voluntary carbon offsetting or compensation beyond sort of the boundaries of companies' operations and direct impact on the climate. So the SBTi is a focus on emissions reductions pathways towards net zero, but recognizes that there's an important need to fund emissions reductions elsewhere today. But it would be as a sort of a compensation or a contribution mechanism. So beyond value chain mitigation is not quite the same as sort of offsetting or claiming carbon neutrality. It's making this sort of demonstration of your commitment to climate action, and also companies being able to compensate for or cover the emissions that they're currently making by funding things that are very, very important to take place right now, because there's lots of climate action that needs to take place around the world, and beyond value chain mitigation is a way to think about how companies can contribute to that while also getting to net zero.
Can I just add one point on that I think that relates to another question that came through? Just to be clear, you can't create a carbon credit and use it against your emissions when it comes from a reduction within your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, because that is double counting, because you're benefiting from the reduction in emissions on the one side, and then you're making a reduction, you're creating a credit on top of that. So a carbon, by definition, a carbon credit to offset against your emissions has to be outside your company's influence.
Great, thank you. Thank you both, Guy and Lucian. So a question for the Freshfields team, perhaps for you, Vanessa, regarding the different ways of procuring carbon credits. Do you find that the price increases with control?
Not necessarily. There's a lot of different aspects, and Trove is probably closer to the pricing than we are, but there are a lot of different contributors to the price, and we've seen some fairly attractive prices in funds and partnership models where there's actually really quite a lot of control, but it may be that the price is cheaper because it's a reduction or an avoidance credit as opposed to a removal credit, or it might have a really long vintage, meaning that it's a project which isn't going to deliver for quite a long time, and so there's a really quite significant reduction in price just purely because of accounting, because it's so far into the future, and there's uncertainty around it. It really does depend also how the control is delivered. So if you have increased transparency, then obviously that can add to the development costs, but it won't necessarily add to the cost as much as, for example, permanent sterilisation of land. And we still don't have many legal systems where that can absolutely be delivered. But one where that has been done is in Australia, where there is an ability to caveat the title of a piece of land, which has been used for a carbon project forever. And if that's done, then obviously that type of project is more expensive. It really depends what type of control you're talking about, but not necessarily. There are ways of achieving control without taking a price hit.
Okay, great. And is there any more comments from anyone else from the Freshfield team or in the Trove team before we move on?
Just a brief comment from me, if I may, on that question of beyond value chain mitigation. I think it's really important to emphasize that some of these projects, particularly in the land use space, have over the last decade or so brought quite a lot of finance into some very, very important social and environmental challenges, not least biodiversity conservation and livelihood benefits. And so whilst the principal reason, obviously, for a carbon credit strategy is to address emissions or offset emissions, it's really important, I think, to sort of think about some of those co-benefits clearly, because let's face it, we've got COP15 now thinking about biodiversity. We have an extraordinary need to find investment in the protection of habitats and biodiversity all over the world. Actually, quite a lot of investment has been coming through the carbon credit route. So it's something sort of, I would say, not the main picture, but a really, really important co-benefit alongside it. And I think that's why that BVCM, beyond value chain mitigation, I think is always going to be a good thing if companies can do that kind of work alongside their decarbonisation to net zero ultimately.
Can I,
Great.
Ashley, can I just pick up one point?
Sure.
In terms of the prices? Can you just let me share screen for one? Because we track the prices of all carbon credits on a weekly basis and create a number of pricing indices that are quite revealing in terms of the trends of these credits. And to pick up on Jake's point, the difference in prices between different project types. You've disabled
Sure, 1 second.
the screen sharing.
Mm-hmm.
And there is really a premium for nature-based products. I don't know, can you see that? Is that sharing?
Yeah.
So the green ones are the nature-based project types, and they're trading at they used to trade at between $10 and $15, and we've seen, particularly for the nature restoration ones, which are the light green charts, this is on the Trove platform, and simulates a large number of transactions every week from over the counter and exchanges. And there is really a premium, and the reason why we've got an increase in nature restoration prices in recent weeks is some blue carbons, mangrove projects, which are becoming highly desirable for all of their environmental benefits, whereas some of the more engineering type solutions, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and non-CO2 gases tend to trade at a discount at around $5 a ton. And so the market is separating out it's pricing in these additional benefits all the time. So and these trends are moving as well. So it's important to keep on top of it.
Great, thank you. I think that is all we may have time for in terms of Q&A. If you have any questions that may not have been answered, please feel free to email anyone at the Freshfields or Trove team, and we will try and get back to you with those responses. Aside from that, the only things left to say really is that the webinar was recorded. So if you'd like to access the recording and slides, they will be available on both the Freshfields and on the Trove Research website. And aside from that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining and all of your engagement. And thank you so much to the Freshfields team for collaborating with the Trove team and for all of your amazing insights on the legal side of the carbon credit world.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Have a nice day. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day.
Bye.